Hi there, and welcome to Shapers, Makers, Builders, and Breakers. I'm your host today, Benjamin Shaw. Shapers is the podcast show that brings you African leadership stories in all spheres of society, where we interview exceptional individuals telling us their story.
This podcast is brought to you by Exeo Capital. Exeo Capital is a leading alternative private equity fund manager that through its 15-year history have focused on investing in African businesses with purpose and impact. Exeo covers the whole of the African continent with investment teams based in Cape Town, South Africa and Nairobi, Kenya, currently managing investments in 9 African countries. The core investment thesis revolves around partnering with exceptional businesses and their teams that have the ability to impact Africa in the decades to come. Exeo does this through providing growth capital to these businesses, but more than that, leveraging a partnership ethos with the companies they invest in. For more information, please have a look at their website, www.exeocapital.com. That is www.exeocapital.com.
A little different to our usual podcasts, this episode is one of a 2-part special in partnership with the SA Innovation Summit, where we got the opportunity to engage with key shapers of the Southern Africa entrepreneurial ecosystem. On this show, we have fascinating discussions with Daniel Novitzkas and Will Green, venture builders and entrepreneurs who each tell their own unique story and share lessons on product development, founder support, business development, and leadership at the coalface. As with all our episodes, this special brings out lessons and insights and offers wisdom and inspiration for us all.
We hope that you will enjoy today's conversation as much as we enjoyed recording it. Without any further delay, let's dive into our next episode of Shapers, Makers, Builders, and Breakers.
I'm with Daniel Novitzkas, who's the co-founder and CEO of Specno. Daniel began his career in the world of tech innovation when he had the opportunity to join Juniver as a product owner in 2015. At the time, if I'm correct, you were still a full-time student at the University of Stellenbosch, and you had found your passion for programming. That part I do know. But in 2018, you launched Specno with a fellow classmate, Jacques Jordan. Mm-hmm. And in the 2 years, you've established Specno now as a leading venture builder in the South African market. You've grown a team of more than 50 designers, developers, product builders. You're across 8 markets. You're in Europe, parts of the United States, and in Asia, I believe, which is quite amazing because along the way, you've also founded several ventures as well. So it's great to see you. It's great to get a bit of a formal chance to find out a bit more about Specno. But before we dive into that, tell me about your background, why you studied what you did, and what you're doing to build this ecosystem over the last 5 to 10 years.
Awesome, cool. Yeah, thank you so much for the intro.
It's weird to hear yourself like that sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. No, it's different hearing a different entrepreneur speak about you and your background and highlight different parts that you might not recognize as part of the journey. To sort of jump into it, I like to date my journey back to a trip that I was privileged enough to take when I was in high school. I got to travel to Silicon Valley, which was home of the startup.
Amazing.
And, growing up in South Africa, I had certainly thought I was going to go down the corporate route, knowing that I wanted to start my own thing, but thinking that, the path is work in corporate 20 years, make money, build a network, and then you can afford to do your own thing. And, I got to the Valley and these kids running around raising millions of dollars and building billion-dollar companies. And it lit something up in me. And I realized that, I wanted to be at the forefront of innovation. I wanted to be in this place that seems to break the rules. They run companies differently. They really empower their people, and their people feel part of this much bigger mission, working way harder and doing things that other people see as impossible. So I came back to South Africa and I basically started to read every book I could about startups and learned about venture capital. I learned that you can lose more money each year and your company be worth more. That blew my mind.
Great model for those who get it right.
So I'm not saying you should do that, but there is a model for that high growth.
Yeah.
And then, I was still in high school, realized I needed to probably do a degree because I didn't really know what I wanted to build yet. I just knew I wanted to be in startups. So I decided to study business management. I was debating between comp sci and business management. My rationale was that what they were teaching in ComSci was probably going to be quite outdated to what was happening and being released in the real world. Syllabuses are slow to change, whereas business is a lot more foundational. It doesn't change too radically over time. So I decided to study business, decided to self-study ComSci and coding, and then I joined Juniver as a product owner.
And what was Juniver?
Sure. So Juniver was a health tech e-commerce company that basically tried to understand what the average athlete needs from a nutritional perspective according to their goals, their exercise routine, etc.
So personalized nutrition?
Pretty much based on like the ingredients of what's out there. So, okay. The nutritional stack. And they would also be able to build a profile of their diet and how often they consume those nutrients. And then we would auto sort of fulfill their order. So we would know in 3 months you're going to run out of your protein. We'll auto have your shipment ready, etc.
Sure. So that's where you cut your teeth.
It's where I cut my teeth, but also learned the frustrations within the South African startup ecosystem. Because, I was reading all of this from the Valley and how quickly they build. And they're talking about this lean methodology and these feedback cycles.
Was that the generation of the lean startup? That book?
For sure.
Okay.
For sure. It was one of my first books, and I was like, this kind of seems like a bit of a Bible, but we'll still get into that. But at Juniver, it was kind of like, take orders from the CEO and then write an 80-page brief, hand it to the developers, wait 6 months, and they would give us something that would, our customers would be really irritated at this new system. And it was just everything I read, this is not how you're supposed to develop product. And that was my first time I got to understand that, particularly 5+ years ago, the understanding of how to build startups is not something that's being taught in South Africa. If we just look at Estonia, Skype, they were one of the pioneers in Estonia. They built the first unicorn there. 200 companies have been spawned from Skype employees since then.
Wow.
We don't have those success stories in South Africa where employees joined from the beginning. They got to see this company scale and it got to exit for billions of dollars, and the employees became rich, became investors, and started their own thing. So we're still on the first generation of founders that are finding their feet. They're fumbling. They don't have mentorship. They don't understand. And I felt that at Juniver. And that is where, I guess, now we transition into my first startup comes into play. So myself and my co-founder, we had met at university. I think, we were relatively loud for our lack of experience, but we were saying, we're studying the Valley, we're studying these frameworks, we understand how to build. In theory, we understand how to build.
Oh, you got to start somewhere.
We got to start somewhere. And we had an angel investor reach out to us to say they've already funded a company and it's just not taking off. They're really struggling with the product. Our lecturers have told them that we understand business, we understand product, and we're claiming to understand startup. So joined that. That was in agri-tech, and the idea was to use an optimization engine to basically look at how much fertilizer soil or plant needs in order to grow it at its optimal. And one of the things we realized in South Africa is that it's only the big commercial farmers that have access to those specialized soil scientists to help them grow more food.
Agronomists,
agronomy. So we developed this pilot program where it would just analyze the sample. We built all the norms into, the program, and then a subsistence farmer could come and say, I want to grow tomatoes on this bit of soil. And in our pilots, we gave them recommendations that 3x the amount of food they produced in 1 year.
Wow.
We tripled the amount that they produced in just 1 year. And it was this crazy feeling of we've designed something that can change the world. It can change the income for subsistence, typically poor farmers.
Which is a huge portion of Africa. And as the world knows, producing more food is also becoming a huge problem that we need to solve for. And then also, fertilizer, bad farming practices is such a pollutant, a cause of climate change. So if we could just solve the fertilizer issue, it could lead to so many positive knock-on effects.
And then the trouble became of now, how do we actually build a startup? So we had gone through an accelerator.
So just to pause there, so you had built a product. Was it your company at that stage, or was it just part of a team? You were part of a team?
So we had minority equity stake, and we were being recognized as co-founders.
As co-founders. So from this point, you'd been bitten by the bug.
I was bitten hard, and it was my 24/7. And I feel sorry for the girl I was dating at the time, but I was so invested in the startup.
Right.
And yeah, honestly, like it was one of those things where I was imagining this is going to be the next 10, 20 years of my life, and we're going to change the world. And we went through an accelerator program. We went to London. We got to present on stage at the World Summit of Agri Innovation. Like, we're presenting to some of the biggest agri companies, having all of these interesting meetings. We got to raise our first round of funding. I got to be rejected by so many of the South African VCs.
What a privilege.
What a privilege. So really got to learn the market, and both through the rejection and through the accelerator, I realized that we're almost on the precipice of the evolution of our startup ecosystem. There were now suddenly dozens of other entrepreneurs just like me who were ready to be the first to come and build, but were still facing the same problems, whether that was understanding how to build to get into market, how to build a very simple MVP, as well as how to navigate, investors, fundraising, limited access to capital or revenue, very complicated sales cycles, which is notorious in South Africa's ecosystem. Very small consumer market, very complex relationship-driven enterprise sales.
One of the challenges of African entrepreneurs, which you've just highlighted, is the lack of skills. They haven't done it before. They aren't mentors that are able to progress. One of the things I'd like you to explain to us, because people talk about tech in inverted commas often, what is the difference between programming, which you said you've learned yourself, product development, which was your first role, product management, and product design? I know now you have sort of teams working in each three, but maybe just define those for some of our listeners who might not be as au fait with that distinction.
For sure. No, it's a great point. So, and that was also one of the challenges that we saw is a lot of founders, if we take our angel investors as an example, they would want to hire from Capitec or the banks, or like the guys who almost claim to have these really great programmers because they're the industry leaders, they can afford the best programmers. But a lot of these programmers are only taught how to write script. They're not taught how to build a product, and they've never built a 0-to-1 product. They're being directed by probably a product owner and told, this is the ticket you need to work on, this is what you need to develop and do. Now, you also have product owners that basically specialize in, it's an advanced form of sales. All you're doing is you're talking to your customer and you're figuring out what are their problems and how do you simplify those problems into basically, plans of action for a team to come in and design a product to solve. And then, of course, you've got your product designers that, we think of our product designers as the people that make it easier for users to actually use our systems, our ideas, our solutions. Because it's not just a case of build and put in front of a user, but how do you make their experience so attractive, so easy, so intuitive that a 60-year-old farmer who does not want to listen to a 22-year-old English kid tell him about tech suddenly sees this piece of technology. So compelling, can so easily interact with it and immediately sees value. They want to use it, they want to tell their friends about it. And that theory is something that's not taught in South Africa, unfortunately.
I think that's spot on. And I really appreciate the distinction, partly because it goes to show the credentials of someone who's done it, actually been there before, seen it happen, helped other teams do it. And partly because it's what a lot of old industry misses about the new tech wave, where there are distinct roles, there are positions which might not carry a revenue title, but are fundamental to the build process. And speaking from personal experience, I also got that wrong in the beginning, where you just don't have that expertise. So you were developing the expertise, you did it in first your product management role, and then as part of this co-founding a startup. What progressed from there?
Look, things were going well in the first startup. We had hit over R1 million a year of software sales, which for a South African startup, it's good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Few startups make it to that mark here. But like I mentioned, we were recruited in by an angel investor, and by the time we raised our next round of funding, we effectively had no control of the company, and suddenly we were building what the investors wanted, investors that are spending a fraction of their time in the business, which is not how you can build a world-changing billion-dollar startup. So I think we just realized too early on that the mistakes were too great for us to continue the journey. So still in super good terms with the team, but we almost made the decision that it's time for us to focus on the next startup. That next startup happened to be WardWorks. We started that with another founder, Peter Ann, and that was in the health tech industry. And suddenly we had the opportunity to leverage what we had learned in sort of our first practical startup. It wasn't just the books out of Silicon Valley.
But different.
And I'm so glad we did that startup, because we decided, based on our past, fundraising experience, we're going to bootstrap this one. And bootstrapping is a whole different ball game.
And bootstrapping is the ability to build out a company from nothing without raising external capital, or certainly for a period without raising external capital, before you would consider institutional rounds later.
Correct. So we needed to find a way of getting money for this thing without investors.
Stay alive, yeah.
Stay alive. And I would certainly consider, putting money in as friends, fools, family, to maybe still be considered bootstrapping. But in this case, we had pretty much exited with nothing from our first business. And we almost had nothing but experience to put into our next business. So one of the things we decided to do was to just really understand our users' pain points and to almost identify a niche distribution channel that would give us some sort of competitive advantage, and then leverage that advantage to partner with somebody with money. So we ended up going to some really big South African corporates to say, this is the product we're building. This is our unique way to distribute that product to your key target audience. Would you like to be a part of what we're building? And we managed to raise all the funding we needed to build out a team, to build the product, to get to market, and to continue monetizing the product to the point of its profitability.
And when you say monetize the product, what was the product? Give us just an overview. And I think I just want to double click on what you said there. You exited with no money, with nothing but experience. But that's not a throwaway line. That puts you in the top 5-10% of entrepreneurs willing to get back in the arena after round one. And I think just to highlight that's a huge advantage when people are dealing with companies, with advisors or coaches who've never been in the arena, who've never actually fought for a founder or on behalf of a founding team. It's a very different proposition to the three founders walking into the office and actually explaining how to do it.
For sure.
So what was the product? What was that that second opportunity you took as a startup, the three of you?
Sure. So it was at the height of COVID. One of our co-founders has a medical background. She had just gone through a ComServe years and realized how incredibly stressful and confusing it is for a new doctor to step into an emergency room and have to tend for patients. Now add COVID and that complexity to it. So we pretty much designed a tool that would make it easier for doctors and sort of the people in the ComServe ward to tend to their patients. Just from understanding the tasks that they have to do to seeing which teams worked on what, etc. And then, we built that out that then got used by 8,000 doctors throughout South Africa. So it really made a difference. But it was also one of those opportunities where incredible starting opportunity. But if I'm being honest, myself and my co-founder, myself and Jacques, we don't have enough experience in the medical field, and it's regulated, it's a difficult field to build in. We didn't have enough experience that we could instantly come up with the next product, the next idea. So we would fundamentally have to disrupt the profitable business we had built in order to build something bigger. Whereas we had our other co-founder, brilliant individual, for her it was satisfying the mission. We were actually helping doctors look after their patients better. So there was no almost need to disrupt at that point, but there was that itch, an even greater itch. We loved the process of building. We had now done it fundraising, we had done it bootstrapped. We had seen so many other entrepreneurs in South Africa struggle. Can we start a venture studio that is actually a for-hire studio, but that specializes in startups and helping the founders through to that next round of funding. And that's what Specno became about.
Wonderful. Now, Specno has developed more than just one product. You've obviously grown a team. I mentioned now with about 50 people, part of the Specno family. Mm-hmm. How has that progressed as a brand? And maybe define for us what it was that you set out to do and what a venture builder is able to accomplish in the ecosystem of Africa.
Sure. So I think this is also where I don't necessarily want to confuse the listener too much, because what we set out to do and what we're building towards is not always what people see at face value, but hopefully I can explain it. So when we started and we realized that entrepreneurs were facing all of these problems, we really believed that our prior to, let's call them successes, were due to the fact that we had been lucky enough to spend so much time reading the theory of how to build a startup, and then got introduced to an environment where we got to practice theory. One of the things we also realized is the learning curve is so steep that without a passion or without the ability to experiment with that knowledge, you almost don't want to consume and learn. So finding a way to make knowledge more accessible, more easier to visualize, experiment, test, validate was one of the things that we actually wanted to solve. So we came up with 3 succinct missions. The first was we wanted to write the framework and the rails to help entrepreneurs go from concept to commercialization within SaaS. So building software, how do we give founders access to tailored knowledge? How do we give them access to tooling? How do we give them access to distribution, partnership, competitive advantage that makes it easier for them as an entrepreneur to build their startup?
And that's now speaking specifically on the product side, or did you cover HR, legal, structure, fundraising? How extensive was that mission?
So when we started, the idea was to almost build a AI-based co-founder into a founder's pocket.
Well, that would have been slightly ahead of the times.
Yeah, so I don't think we quite knew how quickly AI would advance. And so we were really trying to conceive different methods for giving founders tailored education based on the particular problem that is preventing growth.
Okay.
And that could be a people problem, that could be a product problem, that could be a fundraising problem. But we started in product. Later, we went a bit to go to market and a bit to fundraising, and that's sort of how Specno evolved.
So what was the second mission?
So the second mission was we actually wanted to make it time-based and measurable. So we decided, let's aim to build this into a platform that 1 million entrepreneurs use by 2030. So the idea is still almost like an ed tech component where 1 million entrepreneurs are going to use our frameworks to build their startup. And then goal 3 was build a commercial model that makes that scalable and sustainable, so that it's not just 1 million by 2030, but it keeps growing. And we fundamentally allow people to solve problems around them. That's one of the ways that we believe we could change the world. Now, of course, we had set those 3 grand goals. How on earth did we actually achieve that? And so we realized, going back to the lean startup theory, feedback loops, it would be incredibly important to actually build a consultancy, so that we can teach our framework to consultants, and they can come in and they can implement for our clients that are paying for those frameworks, those services, that understanding, but also so that our consultants could learn how those learnings are being utilized. Is it actually making an impact? And so with every startup, we basically got to see what works, what doesn't work.
Iterate on your own methodology.
Iterate on our own frameworks. And very quickly we realized that we can't just adopt what is coming out of Silicon Valley because it's a fundamentally different ecosystem. We actually need to tailor the advice, the recommendations to the city that we're building in. So almost to get more practical with the plans, what we decided to do is to launch a consultancy in 100 cities, with each consultancy basically building a knowledge pool localized to that city, but where each consultancy is feeding a mothership that is like the generalized framework, and then it's context specific to each city, and each one of them is for-profit, service-based, attached to a fund. So the idea is still to build a fund on top of it where we invest in the top performing startups. We basically need to create each part of the pie to give our founders not only the maximum chance of succeeding, but also to act as a carrot for new entrepreneurs to say, wow, these founders have gone through this framework, they've raised funding, they've exited, they've built the ecosystem. It's a very low barrier to entry for me to start learning through these frameworks, to identify a problem, to have a startup coach in my pocket. And only this year, with sort of GPT-4 going so mainstream, have we started to really experiment with what AI can do. And I've been mind blown by the level of advice, tailored advice, that these systems can generate. So I definitely see one day every startup will not only have a coach in their pocket, will have a reporting tool to understand the health of their business and get tailored advice based on those different health points.
If I was to define Specno, I'd like you to correct me. I would see your role as ecosystem building with a framework that you've deployed and are willing to put your name behind, and with consultants helping to not just generate clients, but go in and work with those clients to see it to fruition.
For sure.
Is that a fair summation of how you see where you are today?
For sure.
And where would it, and sorry, just to add to that, if that is where it is today, you've just mentioned AI going forward. What does that transition look like? You've mentioned the funds. We're here at the SA Innovation Summit. There are amazing startups presenting. There's dignitaries from around the world. What is the next step to get there?
For sure. So I think it's probably also worth mentioning that with Specno, we bootstrapped, and within sort of 5 years, but mainly 3 years of me being in Specno full time, we managed to grow to 150 startups, 50 full-time employees. And it was only this year, May, that we raised our first round of outside capital, but not in the conventional, raise into the business. We actually raised on a franchise model. So we have partners in Sweden, Q Group, with the idea of us actually aggressively relaunching different Specnos into different cities in a profitable manner, with the ability to grow and scale those entities very quickly. So there's almost two sides that we need to focus on. The one side is we need to build a flagship. So Specno South Africa needs to succeed. It needs to be able to produce high-value startups that increase the likelihood of an entrepreneur succeeding. If I don't know who's proven the stat, but people love to throw around that like 90% of startups fail, right?
It's a well-known stat, that's right.
So if we can increase that to 80% of our startups fail, 70%, 50% of our startups fail, we're fundamentally increasing the likelihood of an entrepreneur to get to market by, magnitudes. So we want Specno to be our base learning, our framework, our blueprint, but now we finally have the capital, the partners, the means to take that into international markets where there is funding in international markets that can accelerate our journey, and those learnings still apply to South Africa, and so do the bridges, the connections, because once a startup is built here, the natural evolution is to say, where's the next biggest opportunity? And that's often Europe and America and expanding abroad.
It's fascinating. There's so many people bring in the view that Africa is in need of saving, that solutions must exist elsewhere, that we must deploy here, we can't develop them here. And yet, in this model, you're actually taking your solution and franchising outward, which is fantastic. I was reminded, you said a bit earlier, you were talking about the attrition rate, 90% of startups failing. Sean Park has a famous quote, I'm sure you know it. Building a startup is like eating glass, chewing glass. Eventually, you just become used to the taste of your own blood. You enjoy it. And I heard earlier at the summit, actually, someone telling me that that all startups, or all founders of startups bleed. 80% of it is not their fault, and 20% it is. and using, combining those two, if you are able to reduce the rate from 90 to 70%, if that 20% of founder fault becomes washed away in the process you run, the framework, you'd have done an immense service to the community, to the ecosystem. You mentioned you're building out a fund. The ecosystem of South Africa is still new, it's growing, but it needs a lot more. What is a lot more? So outside of Specno, what are you enjoying seeing in the ecosystem? What are you finding is working well? Where else are pockets of excellence developing?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I've noticed is the increase in opportunity to network and network within the startup ecosystem, because it doesn't help trying to get a mentor that's been a corporate CEO of a JSE 100 company and they're trying to teach you how to build management systems for like 1,000-person company when actually you just need to get to market, you know.
And you're lucky if you don't pay for that hour of coaching sometimes.
Exactly. So, you know, I mean, we host the Founders Den, which is an event for founders that are post-launch. They actually have proven that they're not just talk, which is a bit of a problem in our country. I think, you know, building a startup's become quite a sexy word and people want to do it. But I think, you know, if you're in Silicon Valley, it's so expensive that you can't afford anything but to actually work your ass off and build a startup. Whereas here, it's almost still a little bit fluffy at times. And you kind of need to tell the startups to get off the stage and, like, you know, they love the limelight, but it's time to build a business. So I'm personally excited that I am seeing more startups recognize the hours, the glass chewing, the brutality that is required to birth something that is so likely to fail, and yet you are determined to see it succeed. But, you know, that said, there is still an immense amount of work that needs to go into this ecosystem at all levels. You know, aspiring entrepreneurs still need to learn how entrepreneurship can pull you out of your economic status or your circumstances, you know, a road to prosperity with passion and control that a lot of people would want to do. And a lot of people still think the barriers are too high, the risks are too high. They don't recognize that there are, you know, accelerator programs, that there's early stage funding, that there is mentorship. So we need aspiring entrepreneurs to learn what's possible. We need current entrepreneurs to recognize that it's not a zero-sum game. It's actually a positive-sum game. If you raise capital, there's no less capital for me. In fact, there's way more capital because now other investors see Africa as a promising place where capital can be invested, and they want to flock down and they want to spend their money. So I want to see my brothers and sisters.
Well said, yeah.
Yeah, I want to see my brothers and sisters succeed. You know, I want to see them raise. I want to see them exit. I want to see them build big businesses. And so we need to teach each other how to help each other build big businesses. And then mentors and corporates need to learn how to work with early stage, high risk ventures. You know, our corporate market is still so status quo. You know, they're focused on their short term KPIs. They don't want to take big risks. But the reality is, like, the system's working for some, but the system is really not working for others. And there needs to be levels of disruption. And I personally, it's a view that's changed, but I personally think that some of the best innovation that's going to come out of Africa will be seeded by corporates that are willing to invest in innovation.
Well, I hope a number of the listeners to the pod will sit up and realize the opportunity that lies there. We need to sort of tie things together. I'd like to ask two more questions. The one is, what sort of resources would you recommend to people? You've mentioned the Lean Startup. That was sort of the generation of Silicon Valley's social media boom, if I recall. And there was a lot of iterative work being done. Programmers were able to push out product really quickly. That methodology may have changed a little bit, but the thinking is we should still be testing things in theory before going into practice. So what kind of books or resource or podcasts would you recommend to maybe founders? And then particularly interested in what are the habits that founders that you work with have developed that you would recommend people nurture and grow themselves in?
For sure. So interestingly enough, from our early stage experimentation, even just GPT-4 vanilla, like going on OpenAI's website without any custom prompting, I think if you have to give them context of what your problem is and what your startup is, they could even help you identify what your problems are. They can come up with solutions for how to solve it. So, I'm starting to work with the tool for at least 2 hours a day. It's become like really part of my daily routine. And you can get book recommendations from it. Like I'm a huge advocate for leveraging like the technology that's available out there today.
Okay.
And I think, the rate of entrepreneurship is going to keep increasing because the tools, the frameworks, the learning is going to keep getting better. But I would also say that, like, I've got friends, I recommend a book to them, and the book is so fundamental to understanding a certain theory, and they'll say, cool, I'll look it up on Blinkist. I'm like, there is no way you are going to learn and understand the context by a 15-minute summary.
Sure.
Like, even the book is not quite enough to really
grapple with it,
grapple the lesson, but at least the story and the showcases in the book allow you to understand the theory. A lot of entrepreneurs say, like, the best way to learn is to fail. If you're playing chess, the best way to learn is not actually just suck at chess the whole time. The best way to learn is by looking at the strategies deployed by the best and to learn the winning strategies and try and avoid the losing ones. Mm-hmm. You learn from your mistakes, but you try and learn from others that have succeeded. And books are a great resource. Now I think GPT will be another great resource for that. Remind me of the second question.
So you're recommending reading particular books, continue to use AI. I also asked about the habits of successful founders. So let's assume they're doing those too. What else are you seeing?
For sure. Well, I think to maybe bring it back to almost the point of the podcast, which is leadership, right? I think that's maybe another area where we really are quite under invested almost in South Africa. I've come to realize that there's a big difference between leadership and management, and both of them are so crucial for the success of a business, but leadership is almost more important in the pre-management systems of a startup, the getting off the ground, and being able to inspire and to motivate the people around you to join this impossible mission and to put their all in becomes such a fundamental skill. And everybody knows, like, leaders lead by example, right? And in a startup, that's even more brutal because we expect so much of our team, our employees, but that needs to be shown by your own commitment levels. And so the early days of building a startup is almost this hunger to learn, hunger to improve, hunger to solve, like to solve the problem at hand, to solve the problem for your customers, and to breed those perfect, maybe not perfect, but idealized perfect habits that you're trying to follow into every employee, lead them towards being an owner, a founder, and maybe to challenge something you said as almost the last thing. So yeah, probably if we're trying to analyze it from an objective standpoint, 80% of why startups fail is maybe not the founder's fault, but one of our values at Specno, maybe a bit cliche, but is extreme ownership, really taught by the book Extreme Ownership, How Navy SEALs Lead, right?
It's a great recommendation.
And so if you look at every situation as your responsibility to learn how you could have improved, done things differently, changed, once you apply that level of ownership, you realize how much is actually your fault and how much you could change. And I certainly think that like the best entrepreneurs, like they bend the world around them to their will. They make something happen out of the impossible. So I would say those traits are what founders need to emulate and then teach on to their team.
Fantastic. Extreme ownership. That's a good one to add on at the end. Thanks, Dan. It's been great to catch up.
Oh, Mr. Ben, thank you. Love this.
Joining me now is Will Green, who's a serial entrepreneur, having worked directly with Yahoo, Sky.com, Amazon, and even Manchester United, although I will forgive him for that. You're now active in the early stage investor and advisory space. As I understand it, Will, you've nurtured and advised ventures across the startup spectrum, right up to multi-billion dollar companies. And you've got over 20 years experience in this, so it'll be great to unpack it with you. Your focus is mostly high-growth technology, financial, and media industries, which is a really interesting set of sectors. And you also chair a non-profit organization. I think it's a massive 200 million org.
Now that was in my previous life, but I am sort of a board member on a charity called Pedal Project, and also Women in Technology. So those are my sort of current sort of philanthropy sort of positions.
Initiatives. Okay, so even more experience. And you're also building at the same time a global portfolio of early stage venture.
Yeah.
So you're already known to a large number of our listener base. I'm particularly excited unpacking what it is that drove you to this path. You had the career ladders lined up for you. You had corporates to work in. How did you get to where you are now?
So I think it comes way back when I was conceived, and my father is an entrepreneur, and he started a market research business, second generation or first generation South African. So he came over from the UK. And so that sort of entrepreneurial DNA and gene has kind of been in me. Also, my grandparents, actually my grandfather and grandmothers, were very entrepreneurial and in sort of sales as well. So yeah, I think there is something about genetically
bit of nature,
nature versus nurture. But having said that, I kind of in the intro sort of had a little bit of a giggle because you talk about the sort of career which was poised and. I studied science at university, a BSc in physiology and zoology at UCT. And I say to my daughter, who's looking at career plans around sort of, what should you study? I said, listen, your father was like 22 with an insect net on the upper campus. Don't worry too much. But I think what I learned there was the scientific method and how it gets applied to entrepreneurship, to investing, because it is a very structured process, and effectively there's no failure in science. You're kind of standing on the giants of people before you, and you're learning as you're going. So you're always reiterating, you're pivoting. So that's one thing I took out of that.
So that's a key lesson. Entrepreneurs often talk about validating their assumptions. As you say, it's not wrong. It's just either validated or proven false. That's a great approach. Did you apply that straight from university, or was that a reflection a bit later?
I was always, I went down the physiology route to kind of go into exercise physiology, and I realized, down that route, you'd have to sort of spend a lot of years becoming professors and doctors in that. And I generally like people. I think your subjects in exercise physiology are people, unlike other sort of science, which are more like sort of, frogs and mice. But from that, my father was an entrepreneur, and really I wanted to be more involved in sort of building businesses and marketing and sales. So I sort of pivoted there. At university, I knew what the name of my company would be. When I actually would get to that.
What was that?
It was actually called Apurimac.
Apurimac.
Which is basically the source of the Amazon River. So I was very curious about, the sources of things. And it's got a story about sort of, like on the Nevada Meso in Peru, there's a mountain and there's a trickle, and you start as a small little idea, and it meanders into the world's largest kind of river, with bulk of water. But there's lots of lessons during that journey as well. I partnered with Yahoo, and effectively picked the wrong partner. Sort of had to sort of close Apurimac down. So I've been through the roller coaster, which is entrepreneurship. I think as South Africans, we'd like to paint a pretty picture about the journey, but the reality is you get a lot of scars in the way, and the way that I do approach my advisory work is very honestly with entrepreneurs to support them, because it is a very lonely endeavor, and you do need people to support you during that journey.
I think that's really well said. I think I love the analogy of a trickle becoming a broader stream, and of course those particles of water get really hit by a lot of rocks on the way.
Yes.
And there are many streams that don't quite make it to the final river.
Perennial and non-perennial rivers where it dries up, and then you got to get some capital in, and it rains,
That's your science coming in.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think your comment on being able to advise is so interesting because a number of coaches and leadership programs offer advice from a theoretical level or from a corporate looking up at startups, either to acquire or possibly to acquire from. So that sets you a bit apart. Maybe before we talk about venture building and the advisory work you do, take us back. You mentioned you were conceived. That is the start. I can't disagree with that. But who were you and why have you gone on this path between studying, starting your own company, and now advising? How has that transition been?
I think it's any entrepreneur will know that there's this kind of embedded frustration around being a little bit different. You've got you want to create some value, and I think for me there was always I think the quality that I had was I was very curious, around why, so I think that's the first quality I always look for in entrepreneurs.
Curiosity.
It's having curiosity, but then also more than that, being, people name their babies, each company has a name for their company, like why did you call it that? And you get some very interesting stories around why the people call their companies certain things. Even if it was over their first customer. I had one company, Mark One, and their first customer's name was Mark. So it was a great way to start that. So I think it just off that curiosity. I think also having been involved in marketing and advertising and media, it brought an element of empathy. When you are sort of building campaigns to sell products and to build brands, you need to be able to put your feet in other people's shoes. So that is very important with that, as well as in marketing. It's all about trying things. You've got to have courage to sort of try new ideas or new concepts. So I think that's kind of has put me in good stead for a while.
Now, you mentioned the origin of the name of the company.
Yeah.
What was it that you did straight out of university? What were the daily activities of Will in those days?
Yeah, I think it was. I think it comes down to anyone who's working in a company. It's really to build up a reputation around how you work. So being very hardworking, very diligent. Because at the end of the day, there will be people who are looking at you and say, you would be a great leader or a great entrepreneur, and they will support you. I've been supported by many people and partners down the line, whether it was Marvin from Yahoo, who saw something in me, relating to being their sort of sub-Saharan Africa partner for that American tech company, to Barry from Team Talk, so you and Paul from Heart80, who is a sort of a coach of mine. So I think it's just acknowledging that you need to build this kind of
this profile,
just tribe of people but it all boils down to being intelligent, and also being open to advice and also working hard. I think it boils down to the basics.
Well, what I really like about the journey you've undertaken, and something that doesn't always come across to entrepreneurs in their first startup or second startup, is the value of business relationships before you do your own thing. You've mentioned now, just rattled off 3-4 names. You've probably got a list of about 50.
Yeah, I do.
That you've built relationships with professionally before they've become supportive or personal. Tell us a bit about the difference between the corporate landscape and the startup landscape, the smaller companies now trying to learn from the experience that you can leverage.
Yeah, so I think it really boils down to, like the long view. It's I want to be in a position where when I do pass, everyone's going to die, that your church or your place of worship is full. So it's building those relationships, and also just, how that translates into sort of corporate South Africa. And there's so much opportunity with collaboration with corporates. I think that it takes very strong leadership to acknowledge that you need to work with the startups and the ecosystems to drive innovation, to take this whole country forward. I think South Africa is in a unique position, and most African countries are in a unique position in the fact that, maybe 60 or 80% of the economy is driven by corporates, whereas in like more sort of countries like the US, maybe like 30 or 40%. They've got a much higher medium middle class. So therefore, they're much more open to innovation. So it really comes from corporates' leadership and being pushed down to drive innovation. I always use the example of Michael Jordan from FNB, you know. So he started tweeting, he surrounded himself with very strong people, and he was very open and acknowledged people when they drove innovation into the bank, even creating millionaires by sort of awarding R1 million if your idea came through. And then I think it's also acknowledging the entrepreneurs within corporates.
Well, that's a great example of that.
Because exactly, you've got to know that there's got to be this individual who's going to be your sponsor, the person that is empowered, you know, to engage with startups and small businesses, and to navigate that sort of procurement and the strategic and the political landscape that exists in all corporates. So I think those are just some things to think about.
And good points of reference on both sides of the coin. You know, if someone is comparing the two worlds, the corporate world and entrepreneurship, some of the considerations, and then of course entrepreneurship and going alone. You already mentioned quite a lonely journey to some.
Yeah.
You said a bit earlier, you know, you had a bit of nature. It sounds like you also had some nurture as you developed your skill set. And when I read through your profile, I picked out sort of business development seems to be a golden thread through your journey.
Yeah.
It's seldom defined.
Yeah.
What is business development? And particularly, I'd like you to say a little bit about what it means in Africa.
Sure. So I'm very, very passionate about this. I always say this, something my father taught me, you know, there's only two types of people in business. You know, you've got a buyer and you've got a seller. And essentially,
Pretty black and white.
All entrepreneurs, all business leaders, all startups are sellers. And it's bizarre because it's one of the most valuable skills that can actually that can actually change someone's future, financial future. But it's one of these things that's not taught, you know. So a lot of the work that I do specifically in the ecosystem is to train entrepreneurs to think about sales, because even if you're listening to this and you hear the word sales, you know, you have images of call center agents and insurance salespeople, and no disrespect to those industries, but that's the unfortunate, or a secondhand car salesman like Danny DeVito in that movie, you know.
Yes.
Or Boiler Room, or your Wolf of Wall Street, you know, these kind of predatory sort of sales things. So, but I think, you know, it is about business development. It's about relationship development. It's really about being I think it's all about value creation. You know, I think that's the bottom line, you know.
So if I was to define, I want to build on what you just said. If I was to define an entrepreneur's sales journey, would you agree with the characterization that a founder or an entrepreneur's job is to enhance the value of what they're selling and sell it? Is that how you would say?
I would sort of reposition it and say, listen, you know, you got to be an expert at the problem. So you got to be a real, you know, incredibly strong on the technical side with whatever industry it is. And you've got to be very much customer focused and you know,
and that's the link to sales.
Exactly. So if you reposition it to say, listen, it is all about being a thought leader in whatever it might be, you know, generative AI for document management, and then at the same time thinking, okay, who is this going to help? And what is that actual return of investment? You know, is it going to save them time? Is it going to save them money? Is it going to make them more money? Is it going to increase their customer experience? You know, increase their brand? You know, so it's also finding out exactly, you know, how your product is going to do that. At the beginning, it is very messy. You know, it's not like you can put a ton of money on Google or Facebook or LinkedIn to drive, you know, campaigns. You've got to actually interview lots of people to understand, like, what is that product market fit, and then at the end of the day, get those 100 true fans who are using your product to then endorse it and to refer you to other customers. You know, that is the ideal.
I think that's fantastic. Why don't you give us an example of what a business development journey looks like in B2C and compare that B2B? You've spoken about how corporates run a lot of Africa. I think that's true. advice I was given as a founder was to go and find B2B contracts. Business development was all about relationships upward as opposed to outward. And we built a B2C company, and we were still encouraged to go and find these corporate contracts to give us credibility and some scale.
Yep.
What does business development look like in those two? And then from there, we can talk about venture building and how you advise companies on those two parts.
Yeah, so from a B2C perspective, it's generally a lot harder because there's a lot longer journey that you've got to go on to build a brand, to build trust. And generally also what you find is in emerging venture capital markets, you've got, so VCs will focus more on the B2B, the business to business, because in B2C, you've got to spend money on marketing and advertising. So sort of the numbers are sort of roughly sort of 30% of each sort of VC check that's written into a B2C startup is invested into Google or Meta or LinkedIn or these other video platforms, you know. So you've got to be very strong on the marketing, and also just to define marketing. I think there always gets a confusion between what is a brand, what is marketing, what is sales, and essentially, just to define brand is essentially it's a product with trust. So you've got to build, the trust around whatever that product is. Marketing is literally, especially in B2B, it's kind of lead generation. Anything that is getting people to inquire about what you are doing. It's a very nice way to sort of define it so that you don't sort of get confused. And then sales is converting those leads into a customer and then down the line into a profit partner. That is your best case scenario, that you are meeting with your customer and you're not selling, you're talking about their business and you're talking about how your product has actually helped to boost their profit. That is the end goal.
And I suppose to link back to your earlier comment about founders or entrepreneurs needing to do business development, many founders carry the brand with them. They are the reason you would trust a company. They also have a sense of where to find their clients. They've identified a need somewhere in the market. So their acquisition or their understanding of acquisition is mostly understood. But it sounds, what you're saying is that the sales is really where the rubber hits the road. That's the hard part.
Yeah, exactly. And it sort of, this segues nicely into kind of the venture studio discussion because, I've sort of spoken to the guys. There's a product studio in the States called All Turtles, a guy called Phil Libin.
All Turtles?
All Turtles.
Okay.
So it's Phil Libin, who's ex-founder of Evernote. Rosie and the team, Chris and the team there, they have this saying, that, as an entrepreneur, you're very good at building a product. You're a product manager. You're amazing. You're sort of a 10 out of 10. But then suddenly, as an entrepreneur, you've got to learn to sell. You've got to learn to market. You've got to learn to pitch and present, and then you become a pretty average one of those. So it's quite important to see the value of a support network, a studio. Whether it's a product studio or a venture studio, or to actually help you with those skills, So and that's I believe where there is a good model for growth in the space.
So let's segue there. Let's talk about a venture studio. I'd like you to define it. We caught up with Specno recently, Daniel. They have a venture build of sorts. Everyone, not everyone, but many people who build these sort of studios or advisory firms have their definition of what it looks like. What is it?
Yeah, so I've done some work with Louis and Alex at the Delta as well. There's, and also just speaking specifically, with in the sort of African context, like Cape Town's getting quite a good name and a location for creating these studios because it's beautiful. It can attract the best talent. It's obviously and there's a supportive ecosystem around it. There's probably Cape Town's probably got the most number of years in building startups and scale ups than any other sort of obviously Nigeria as well. So yeah, I think I think to define it, it's really it's kind of it's where you can obviously you take an investment in the company. You have a team of developers, of marketers, to kind of almost like a off the shelf sort of version. So you go basically de-risking the whole process. And you're doing that through experience. There is also a fund element where you can invest in that company. Either that's part of the program or it's a separate sort of division. I think, but again, with most venture studios or venture builders, you've got to look at the model. I think they play a very important role in the ecosystem. And I can speak about the Delta. Obviously, done some work with them. They're being very successful, obviously, because they've got a great sort of bridge into the Berlin and German ecosystem. So they sort of leverage the talent that is here in Cape Town and for the benefit of their ventures in that market. So that's a great model. And if you can build the product, you can also launch it, scale it, and then have a soft landing in another sort of
in a larger market. Yeah,
that's a great model. I've also spoken to people like Josh and Ragabar, and he's involved in a different model where there's a tech stack.
Where's he from?
He's based Ikeneo Ventures. So he's a Cape Town based entrepreneur, been in the game longer than I have. Got a lot of respect for him, and also went to the same school together. And in some way was a bit of a trailblazer in my journey. But he's been very active with looking at technology that's been built offshore and bringing it into certain markets. That's a different model, which is also quite successful as well. But again, if you look at the sort of the data, generally, VC's internal rate of return, IRRs, average about maybe 25-30%. But if you're closer to the action and you've got a right sort of pilot, always term the founder as a pilot, not a jockey, because generally jockeys are quite dysfunctional. They can win races on horses, but they the personal lives are a little bit fraught. But yeah, it is all about picking the right pilot or the founder who can drive those ventures. But the IRRs with studios, I think the data says they're more around the sort of 40, 50, 60% IRR. So it's a model that is getting a lot of attention as well.
I think that there's a few reasons that the model works. One of them is, as you say, it's usually part of the deal that there's equity provided, and so those terms are far less than a typical VC would maybe access. Another is that you're able to access specialist skills. You've spoken about three groups. Distribution is a word that maybe we can come back to, but let's park that for now.
Yeah, and I just want to touch there.
Yeah, sure.
It all boils down to my current firm, Col.lab, is all about the collaboration. I think that's between all the ecosystem, but it's for the interest of, the majority equity holder. In the most case, it is going to be the startup, who's taken the financial risk in the hope of profit, which is
to partner up. I really like the analogy of a pilot rather than a jockey. The reason I hadn't thought of the relationship being fraught in real life, but a jockey has just one role in which, or rather, he's got one relationship, which is the horse.
Yes.
A pilot can't take off without a team working with him, with a lot of things going right, with the right runway, with the right engine,
and co-pilot,
with a co-pilot, and a number of startups that I'm sure you've dealt with, and I've spoken to, really struggle with the advisory side, where they don't know who to turn to. Is that the advantage of a team of experienced individuals? If you were to summarize the value proposition of a venture builder, what would that be?
Yeah, it is effectively, people who have done it before. But again, it's not for everyone. It's generally possibly for a serial entrepreneur who's looking for the next gig and wants to make sure that they invest their time, in something that has got a much higher likelihood of success.
Right.
So I think that's something to bear in mind versus the first time entrepreneur, because generally also if you quite in a serial entrepreneur like myself, you can partner with people who already in the ecosystem, either with a venture builder, a venture studio, or with a group of other like-minded sort of talented people. But there's no right or wrong model. And I think just on the jockey thing, I've done some research here. This is the curiosity that the right jockey is 75% of the results of winning the race. Obviously, the other 25 is the horse. So they've got a very high likelihood of success, but but like you say, you just focused on the one thing. But when you are running a business, there's so many more multiples of relationships and things you got to think about. So yeah, and capital is the fuel that runs the airplane.
That's right. That's a good analogy. So let's talk about those pilots of yours.
Yeah.
You've dealt with many of them both in your journey as an entrepreneur and now helping other entrepreneurs. What habits have you seen cultivated in the most successful founding teams?
So I think it comes down to the sort of respect for each other, and also, how did they meet? I think that's always an important thing. I think most people look at agreements, even sort of shareholder agreements and agreements between partners. I always say that an agreement is actually a disagreement, because it's the only time that you pull that piece of paper out is when you're thinking about a disagreement. So it's very important to have very strong relationships with co-founding teams, because in most cases, it's going to be a relationship you probably spend more with your partner, with your wife or husband. So, the key thing is to, and what I found with what is successful is those co-founders who've met at university. They've got a lot of history before where they got to adults. And then in some cases, I look at Ulrich and Brad from WizPass. They met because their wives were best friends, so there was already this kind of social contract embedded in to their relationship, so that they would have a support network from their wives or girlfriends to ensure that they could support them during that journey. So I think that's one thing. I think that there's also the university that you've come from. I think I was speaking
Is
to
it the university training, or you mean the network?
I think for those of the listeners who are not from Africa, and there's not that much capital and so rich uncles to support entrepreneurship. So smart students will pass their degree, but while they're at university, they will sort of start thinking about starting their company. And some universities have got the right sort of mix of diversity and support. I can speak for sort of UCT and University of Stellenbosch. They've got great sort of programs, great supportive ecosystems. But I spoke to the guys at Harambins, the international organization of sort of startups, and the founder was saying, what is it about sort of Cape Town? There's such a high probability or proportion of our Harambins are from UCT in particular, and Cape Town in general. So there is something about the ecosystem that supports it, and that comes down to the mentors, the angels, the funders. And I've got this saying, it takes an ecosystem to raise a startup, from the universities all the way through to the person, the corporate that's going to acquire the company if you do sell it one day.
That's insightful. I think the ecosystem building that we've seen here at the summit, and more broadly across not just the founders that have made Cape Town home, but as you say, these venture builders, these studios, and some of the investors who now actively come out. Maybe they come out for the wine, but they enjoy their time.
It's a great, I must say, I think November's becoming a bit of a sort of an ecosystem, sort of a tech ecosystem month. It does help that we've got direct flights from the States, from New York. And during that time, we've got a beautiful environment and wine farms. Like just as one way that I've to build the ecosystem, every Friday at 6:00, I take a group of people up Lion's Head religiously, so rain or shine, I'm climbing it. I've done about 22, and tomorrow actually I've got 12 people from the summit climbing with me. But it's a way to build the ecosystem, and outside of just LinkedIn and these sort of even podcasts. If anyone's listening and wants to climb Lion's Head, if they are ever in Cape Town, happy to take you up. But it is just a way to build an ecosystem, and there's something about climbing a mountain which is quite akin to starting a business. It is a sort of a journey that you take with a bunch of people.
A striking imagery that we can all relate to, although not all of us get to the peak, I suppose.
It's not. It's not so hard. It looks more impressive than it is. It's only 5Ks, but it's very impressive when you're at the top. It's a beautiful view, and it's a beautiful environment with the fynbos and the nature.
No, absolutely gorgeous. My comment was more that the peak of the startup journey is
yes.
more difficult.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question which I really would love to hear the answer to, because a lot of people ask, what advice do you give to founders, to guys who are entrepreneurs starting their journey? I want to ask you not about them.
Yeah.
How do you help motivate the people who work for founders. In these new teams, they don't have the co-founder status. They're just as dedicated to success as those original founders. What do you say to them?
So just I'll answer that question, and I'll also mention some of the qualities of founders from the previous question. I'll start there, then I'll talk specifically about the people working for them. So, apart from sort of meeting where you met, it's also kind of how are you open to advice? Are you looking to improve? So there's an element of ego versus always learning. Because if you're going to get some advice, are you going to apply it? Are you going to consider it? Obviously, it's this kind of self-improvement sort of thing. Discipline incredibly important as well, and communication vitally important. And also just reaching out, being sort of proactive, and going the extra mile, like that's an opportunity if you're going to pitch in, but pitch differently, like be stand out. So those are some of the qualities, and obviously reading and listening to podcasts like this, and being sort of looking at how do you improve yourself. So those are the qualities that I look for. And people that actually update you. I do a lot of sort of LinkedIn and WhatsApp coaching for very young student entrepreneurs, and it is all about them updating me as to kind of what their progress is, because that then shows me that you are someone who's going to stick to your word, and at the same time, work on the weekends as well. The reality is that founders of startups, especially the early stage ones, are also building the ecosystem, because I learned when I was building my business that people come and go, but it's making sure that the bridge is still there, because essentially they might go off and start their venture, and people founders specifically don't think about that they're motivating for those who are who are working for them, and also who might not be working for them, or who might in the future. So I think it's but as a founder, you've got to actually also communicate what is the vision. I think the challenges that you have in emerging markets, India, Africa, the concept of entrepreneurship is a bit of a foreign one, especially culturally. And this was one thing that I find with some founders, whereas if you are the only son and you make a lot of sacrifices to go to university, you've got this amazing opportunity at a consulting firm, and then you decide to become a startup, and then the family starts saying, when are you going to start contributing to the family? When are you? How much are you earning?
The so-called black tax.
Exactly.
Yep.
And or black brown tax, whatever. It's a reality, because that's even harder culturally to explain it. Like, no, it's a startup. I don't get paid a salary. It's like, what?
And that's an ecosystem specific problem where you don't have that issue in corporate, and we are dealt this additional complexity for young teams.
Exactly. And I think that it's just understanding and being empathetic to individuals' unique situations. And that's something that I found and it's even harder, because you even feel more alone and more strange, because you still have this drive in you to start a business, but at the same time, you can't explain to your family, like, what is a founder? You're like, so you're unemployed, like it's very, very hard, because there's a sort of a very traditional way of looking at careers. But I'm very bullish, because over the next 10 plus years, the employment landscape is going to change rapidly, and it's really going to be those people who are entrepreneurs, who can sort of change quickly,
and adapt.
And as we know, it's not IQ, it's not EQ, it's adaptive quotient is the new thing. How do you? Yeah, exactly.
So that's what the founders should do or look to do.
Yeah,
I'm going to press you for an answer there on that team, and the reason for it is because not all of us are founders, and even if we are, we might be for a portion of life, and then we support another venture, or we go to another team.
Yeah,
how do you keep them motivated?
I think it's not everyone does think that they could be a founder, and I think it's understand. Most people see the sort of equity discussion to saying, okay, well, if we sell this business and I've got 10%, then I make X. but also during the downturn, are you willing to put in X, if the company needs it? So I don't think everyone are sort of founders or entrepreneurs.
So not everyone aspires.
Not everyone aspires to that. That's one thing I realize. Some people are just happy to work for the company and do that. And
what makes them happy?
So it is a case of the recognition, the autonomy of basically working,
Which
and it's
is a lot easier in a startup than a corporate.
100%.
Yeah, so that's easy to
So it's the freedom
facilitate.
and also the ability to learn, to be at the cutting edge of AI or health tech. And I'm very, very bullish African entrepreneurs. The reason being is, I'll give an example. I recently went overseas to another ecosystem, and I attended a tech conference. And this is a well-funded ecosystem. And I met an entrepreneur, and it was this massive promotional costume. And it was actually a dog, an anime dog. And I was like, what is this product? This person spent so much money, not even on a stand, but on a costume. And I looked at the sort of leaflet, and it was for dog sun cream. So I was like saying, whereas in Africa, we've got so many challenges that we can solve with startups, with entrepreneurs, with founders. And we literally have got apps and technologies. I look at like Vula Mobile, South African sort of med tech startup who's helping sort of referrals. Dr. Will Mappin, I studied with him at UCT, and his technology is literally saving lives. So there's this real problems to solve. And I think as Africans, and speaking as a South African, we have also got a great attitude. We've got this anything's possible.
And resilience. Yeah.
So if you give us and we've got a really good name in all the industries. If you think of insurance, we've got Old Mutual, we've got Liberty, we've got Sanlam, some of the best insurers on the African planet, and Discovery, growing, innovative. Adrian Gore and his team doing great work there. Retail, we've got phenomenal retailers. Banking, we've got Capitec, we've got Time Bank, we've got Bank Zero, Michael Jordan's new bank. So we've got these. South Africans as business people, I think we don't really see our value globally. But if you do travel, you understand that we are incredibly good at what we do. And also, we also produce some really good rugby players as well.
Yeah, well, let's hope they're good enough in the next few weeks. That's really helpful, and I think also really encouraging to those who, as you say, don't find themselves aspiring to be founders, entrepreneurs, contributing to that ecosystem, staying within it, developing their skill set, and then getting recognized for the contribution they're making. And those are practical takeaways for founders who are currently managing a team. And hopefully people who want to get into the ecosystem with some expectation setting, which is helpful.
Yeah, and it boils down to, I was speaking to a friend of mine who's been at a corporate for many years as sort of head of innovation, and he was like saying, corporate is about certainty. You're going to be paid at the end of the month. Yeah. And entrepreneurship is about freedom. So you've got the freedom to build what you want to build, and also earn what you want to earn, So I think that is it. Also, just as a side note, I posted something on LinkedIn recently that I'm starting to see a trend of actuaries getting into entrepreneurship.
Wow.
Which is...
I wouldn't have seen that one.
No, which is fascinating. You have been trained to calculate risk, and you're calculating risk on your professional career. So are you going to work at an insurer or life insurer or, modeling, or are you going to invest in yourself? Which I think is a very interesting data point, which I'm starting to see. So I'm very aware of that, as well as doctors, actually. I think COVID took a lot of wind out of sails for some doctors, and they're also looking at how they can step out of the sort of traditional sort of medicine into sort of fixing medicine. So I'm also very bullish, sort of health and med tech. So yeah, those are just some things.
Good ones to look out for.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks, Will. That's been great to have you on the pod. And how can people get in touch with you or find out more?
Yeah, so I'm very active on LinkedIn. I think it's just Will Green on LinkedIn. I really like connecting with people. And please connect with me and tell me that you heard the pod, and look forward to connecting with you online and see how I can add value to your life.
Wonderful. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Shapers, Makers, Builders and Breakers. We trust that you've been encouraged by what you've just heard. Subscribe to future episodes and find out more about us at shaperspodcast.co.za. That is shaperspodcast.co.za.
Well, that's right. Don't forget to subscribe for new episodes and other content, and remember, share any feedback with us. We'd love to hear from you. Find me on Twitter at b_d_shaw or via email. We look forward to your company the next time on Shapers, Makers, Builders and Breakers. Until that time, cheers, bye-bye.